In tonight's second pre-election segment, we talk with a candidate for governor's council in District 6. In the city, the district includes East Boston and Charlestown, along with parts of areas around downtown Boston and Allston-Brighton. We'd like to welcome the unaffiliated candidate, Vincent Dixon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for being with us again. First of all, for people who don't pay that much attention, maybe, what does the governor's council do?
It is one of the least appreciated agencies of government in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Any appointment by an executive to be a judge must be confirmed or rejected by an elected body of persons. In many states, that is a state senate. In Massachusetts, Maine, which was part of Massachusetts until 1820, in New Hampshire, it is the elected governor's council. They are two-year terms. There are 8 single-member districts across the Commonwealth that have 5 state senate districts each. I'm using this to talk about those issues. It turns out a lot of what I'm doing is civic literacy and explaining the governor's council itself. It is a vital opportunity, and one that I embrace as an opportunity to publicly educate people and also to talk about some serious issues. We need to have a progressive attention to the legal system. We've just had a great criminal justice reform bill. Didn't do everything, but much of the legal system is not criminal justice, rhetoric aside. We've all signed contracts for rental or lease or loans or other kinds of activities over the years. They're the guidelines at Harvard commencement at the law school. Recognition says those wise restraints that help us to be truly free. And those ought to be done in a more dispassionate and objective way. And I'm talking about not just the duties of the council, but how they might be reformed so that people are more engaged and more respectful.
Well, as you mentioned, the most important thing the council does is you judge the judges before they're appointed.
Indeed.
So what makes you qualified to do that?
Well, there is a common misperception. In fact, the Herald and the Globe have both touched on this a little this year, that somehow you have to be an attorney. Rather, the elected bodies are meant to be ordinary people, perhaps with some skills or backgrounds. A doctor would say, if you don't agree with my opinion, or even if you do, get a second opinion, get a third opinion. I think we need to have people who are in tune with that. I bring something special to it, I think, a little bit, because I'm a historian, and I can in fact tell you how the Governor's Council came to be. It is a relic of a colonial time when the franchise, such as it was from 1630, elected the governor, and the English royal system in 1701 took away the right of the people to elect a governor from 1701 to 1775. And the legislature, in his wisdom, created a standing committee to monitor the governor. The governor in this state cannot provide pardons, commutations, or other powers without approval by the governor's council. And many of us think it has been a wise restraint so that the governor doesn't just release people on the street, doesn't just pardon somebody who gave a campaign contribution because he can't.
You've run for office before as Republican. This time you're unaffiliated.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, the present chaos that we have and the challenges have contributed to that. In fact, 2 years ago, I think the cycle had about 26 unaffiliated candidates across Massachusetts. This year, it's nearly double that, about 46 or so. And in fact, we're now at a point where about 53% of the registered voters in Massachusetts belong to no party. The Republican Party, unfortunately, even to the Republicans who remain, has become toxic. The Democratic Party is beginning to pick up virtue, but hasn't filled out the whole shape yet. And it is a time where we have the opportunity to address the challenges we have. Most people are looking for knowing what the change will be, not whether there is a change, because change isn't always good, as we've seen at the national level.
Well, one problem with the court system, you mentioned, it was the subject of a recent report by the Boston Globe. Those secret hearings that are run by clerk-magistrates, right, and some dubious outcomes from those. What could the Governor's Council do about that?
Well, there's two things. Remember that to have a hearing for confirmation of an appointment to be a judge, all kinds of questions can be asked. And I remember some years ago hearing a judge talk about his career, and he said the most important thing he found was the questions he was asked during the confirmation hearings that forced him to think about what the law is about and what being a judge is about, not just what he had done in practicing the law. Clerk-magistrate system, it turns out Massachusetts is the only state in the United States that has it. It has grown up kind of without a real thought about the system and its role. The Globe, in its article, found that about 40% of the clerk magistrates did not even have a law degree. let alone be an attorney. And I think there's a real problem. I would like to see the establishment of a judicial training graduate school that would train people to be judges, as in England, where they take and recruit the highest graduates of law school and train them to be judges. I think it would be much better to have career judges. No campaign contributions, no prior experience as a defense attorney or a prosecutor, so that we're actually having objective people. The clearest analogy, if you watch the Red Sox, is that you don't take an outfielder and say, you're a good outfielder, we'll make you umpire. We train umpires separately so that they are going to be professionally trained umpires, and we monitor them, and if they do badly, they get sent down to the minors. Those kinds of qualities ought to be in the case of judges and clerk magistrates. I would simply eliminate the clerk magistrate system as it is presently, and if we have any reason for it at all, that they be trained as judges as well. We've done other reforms in Massachusetts over the years, including victim impact statements that people said never would happen. That's been an important thing when it comes to sentencing. I think we need to have a commission of the best law school deans in Massachusetts, all those willing to serve, and look at our legal system. Because there's long due. We haven't done that in about 30 or 40 years. The criminal justice reform was good, but it was only part of the system.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Vincent Dixon, candidate for governor's council in District 6. Another idea you've been talking about is maybe a process for renewing the appointments of judges so we can scrutinize them one more time. Why should that be the case?
We, in our wisdom, have avoided having elections, and I think that's good. Elections for judges in many states prove to be circuses and take away really the autonomous ability to make judgments. But we don't have really a good process for monitoring. I talked to one attorney who wasn't sure about my idea, but she said, you know, there is supposed to be a screening process, and it seems to have no effect. By requiring a term renewal process every 10 years, revetting, reappointment, and reconfirmation, I think that's a reasonable time. Technology is changing, demographics are changing, a lot of other social needs are changing. Right now they're trying to get the judges to deal with some of the domestic abuse issues. We have major sexual abuse issues that have come up in our society. These are issues that have to be dealt with. If you train judges to begin with, and you have a term renewal process every 10 years, you're still being more generous than most of us in an ordinary job. We have an annual review every year. We think that's fine. We kind of expect that. We prepare for that. At 10 years, some people say, I've had my turn, and I'll go off and do something else. It provides an opportunity to fill that through. There are other examples of appointments that go through the Governor's Council that they could ask questions about. And in asking those questions, I would ask a judge whether, in fact, they supported working with clerk magistrates or would like to see that moved in the direction of simply having judges do that, because essentially they have unbundled simple judicial motions to people who have no training in the law, who may be nice people and may actually do good things, but not necessarily have an open process that's fair.
I know a renewal is not the same as an election, but isn't it still a process that erodes the independence of judges from whoever does the renewal?
Rather not. I think by continuing the process of a vetting, the Mass Bar Association does a pretty good job of doing that, and having several steps along the way. All it says is making sure that people are up to date and paying attention to what's going on. I've heard complaints from people. One lady told me that she thought she had a good case and she went to court. The problem was the judge fell asleep. And I said, well, I hope you reported him. And then she said, yes, I did, but they said, we're not going to turn him in because we like him. Well, there's an example of somebody who's a very likable person, but wasn't paying attention. There ought to be some consequences for that, not for individual decisions. You know, the political process is a subtle one, but at 10 years, I think you have more than enough time to judge a judge and how they're doing their job. And if you have professionally trained judges, you will have already changed the process, because it won't be about whether it's a political process, but rather whether the person is keeping that. Hospitals do that all the time. I mean, I love nurses and doctors, and I've encountered some fine ones over the years, but I wouldn't want a first-month registered nurse doing heart surgery unless they had had the training for heart surgery some years later, and they are reviewed on an annual basis by their hospitals and by boards of accreditation in terms of what they're doing, and nobody's afraid of that because most people are pretty qualified.
Well, you certainly have some qualifications as a historian. You really care about criminal justice, but if you want to make changes in it, is it really about being on the governor's council? I mean, you can work through the state legislature to make some changes too. I mean, what's so important about being on the council?
Well, it is the most direct in terms of addressing the legal system. Frankly, government across the board has many problems, as we see. The Governor's Council is a venue. Yes, you can look at the legislature, but the state Senate, by the way, is the body which in many states would be the one to confirm or deny appointments for judges. And this year we've had 3 Senate presidents, and the year is not out yet. They seem to have some instability. They were part of the problem why Massachusetts was the last state to pass a state budget. There are some real questions there. What we need to recognize, this is an opportunity for reform, much like the 1930s, much like the late 1960s and early 1970s, where people are coming back and questioning the fundamental nature of how society works. Massachusetts has an ERA, the United States does not. Massachusetts has been progressive in many ways, but it hasn't revisited those progressive issues in a long time, and this is an opportunity to address those issues. I have worked heavily on many issues. In fact, within my own state rep district, I put a ballot question on that would add or support the idea of adding health care as a right to the Massachusetts Constitution. Most people say health care is a right, but we don't have any legal document to back us up. Like voting, like education, which are constitutional rights, health care ought to be that. The nature of a judge is meant to be not just static, not just reading what was there in 1790 when horse and wagon were the transportation, but to recognize a reasonable dynamic and a reasonable adaptation to social behavior and circumstance within established law. And that's a much more dynamic thing. I'll borrow the Hebrew national slogan, I'm looking for a higher standard.
Thank you very much for being with us. Vincent Dixon, candidate for Governor's Council in District 6.